And we are live. Welcome to Cocktails and Calamity, the show where we get lit, get comfortable, and discuss the technology, politics, and social transformations shaping humanity's global future. Thank you for joining Kristen and I here at the Calamity Desk this lovely Friday evening. I'm so thrilled because our guest today has spent his entire career theorizing about technology, innovation, and the future of the human species. Peter, is it Leyden or Leyden?
Leyden. Yeah,
Leyden. Leyden.
Everyone gets that wrong.
Leyden, my bad. So Peter Leyden is a futurist and a published author. In addition to his 2 books and TEDx talk, he's written in newspapers, Newsweek, and was the managing editor for Wired magazine. His most recent project, Transformation, tells the story, the future history of America from the world from 2020 to 2050. The 6-part series lays out a positive yet plausible scenario of how we could actually solve the greatest challenges of climate change, economic inequality, racial injustice, and political polarization. Peter, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm in sunny California. You can actually see a little of the sun still coming through here. So yeah. I know the East Coast, not you guys, but the East Coast, I think is getting hit with all this snow. So I'm fortunate, I feel, out here.
Yeah, we're lucky. We are in Orlando, so we're not experiencing any of that snow or any of that cold. It's a frigid, 60,
it's our
70?
Beautiful season, right? Well, and usually it's not. Usually we don't get the pretty season until January, February.
Right, but I think we're at like 68, 70. I mean, it's not so bad. But you live in the Bay Area, so you're pretty used to.
We're in a comparable space, but it's great to be here. I'm happy to be chatting about transformation. It sounds like that's a theme you're always or frequently dip into. So I think we're aligned here.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's something that, we've been kind of stuck in this 2020 from all accounts has been a dumpster fire for most people. So looking towards the future and looking for what what could potentially be very positive change, I think it's a breath of fresh air, Peter. So thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Totally.
So I just want to kick this right off by saying that, in your writing, in your piece Transformation, you say that the timing for the coronavirus pandemic was extremely lucky. And so, as so many of us are coming out of this dumpster fire of 2020, how on earth could you say that our timing was lucky?
Well, let me put it this way. From the big picture, historical point of view, which is the way this series, The Transformation, which is, by the way, it's a 6-part series. We're in the 5th part of it now. It's been going through Medium. It's on its way to being a talk, which is going to come out next year, kicking it off. And it's ultimately the beginnings of a book, which I've done several of them before. So anyhow, there is a kind of this transformation. The whole idea is to think about what people literally in 2100, 80 years from now, what will they think looking back on our period of time from 2020 to what's 2050? So to them, it's going to be looking back on the way we look back on World War II or the post-war boom and that kind of stuff. And to us, of course, it's looking ahead for the next 30 years. And so from that perspective, I say the pandemic was lucky in its timing, because if it had even happened just 20 years earlier, let's just say in the year 2000 rather than in 2020, in the year 2000, the internet was such, and again, I was at the early Wired magazine in the 90s there. I mean, this is something that we were all over from a long time, but by 2000, it was really only about a third of Americans, or a third of people in North America were on the internet. And Europe less so. And then, in fact, most regions of the world basically had nobody on the internet, very little. I mean, just a smidgen of elites kind of thing.
Right.
And yet here we are with 4.5 billion people on the planet, everyone like us connected with high bandwidth, able to do video, able to kind of, immediately connect. When that pandemic hit, if it would have hit 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to just kickstart, all this coordination of scientists. We wouldn't have been able to all do our work from home. We wouldn't have been able to have kids in school, kind of immediately gone through video and stuff. We wouldn't have been able to do this even just 20 years ago. Now, that's just one piece. The other piece is 20 years ago, we were just cracking the first human genome at a cost of about $2 billion. It actually happened in 2003. And there were these 2 efforts, if you remember, private sector, public sector one. Anyhow, the point is it took $2 billion. It took a decade of work, and we finally cracked the first human genome. Well, now it takes about $1,000 or less actually to crack an entire human genome. And in fact, we're able to very rapidly and cheaply sequence, let's say, the virus that was breaking out here. And one of the reasons we got a vaccine so fast here was we were able to, the scientific community coordinated through this internet and all these high bandwidth connections using AI and other kind of things. We were able to quickly and just rapidly track the day by day mutations of this virus and really understand it on a level that would have been totally beyond us 20 years ago. So there's another box there. It's a good thing it hit now rather than 20 years ago. The third thing, which I think is a bigger picture looking forward.
Real quick, that's okay. Real quick, I just wanted to interrupt because you said if this were happened 20 years ago, like, do you think this would have been a kind of Spanish flu type of situation if this happened 20 years ago, or what do you think?
Yes, I basically, in this piece, the piece that you were referring to, which is one of the 6 of them, I literally say we probably wouldn't have been that much better off than in the Spanish flu. I mean, one of the reasons of the Spanish flu, they didn't know, at that time, they didn't even know what the virus was. And so that was a cruder thing. They didn't have any way to coordinate globally, on a global pandemic or with internet, let alone, basically phones and stuff could barely go a long distance. Anyhow, so there was, we were in better shape than they were in some ways, but in a foundational way of how we were able to deal with this in a 21st century way, there wasn't a lot different. We would have been dealing with it in 2000 in a 20th century way, long distance phones and coordination that way. And we would have been doing it, with, again, modern medicine, but not really understanding it at the genetic level and the level that we're able to pull this effect. It probably would have taken us, typical 3 or 4 years to do a vaccine. Anyhow, the point is very different than that. But here's the other thing I was just going to say, the third piece, which is why I said it was fortuitous. If we would have hit it 20 years ago, when the entire global economy collapsed and, let's say, oil crashed, which is what we saw in the wake of this pandemic with, flights going to nothing and nobody commuting to work and all that kind of stuff, the oil price of oil crashed and the whole industry kind of buckled. We wouldn't have been able to build out of it with the clean energies it's possible now. And so because solar energy 20 years ago, solar energy was such that it was about $70 a watt. And now it's about 70 cents a watt. And so just simple things like driving down the price of solar panels to kind of be able to scale back up on clean energy wouldn't have been able to happen. So there's a bunch of reasons that, weirdly, from a historical perspective, and certainly for the future, they're going to look back and say, damn, it was good. It was 2020 and wasn't 2000 or let alone 1980 or something like that.
Right. I love that you said that because I think there's this, it's very hopeful for me because, again, like as we were talking about earlier, it's like 2020 just seems like such a dumpster fire. So to be able to look back on this in 5, 10, 15 years and go, you know what? That was the best thing that could have happened. Alicia says the universe is always conspiring in our favor. Timing is everything, whether we know it or not. It's really an amazing thing in where we are and where we're headed. So let's back up just for a second and talk a little bit about your piece, Transformation. Your new piece, which is highlighted on Medium, is written from the perspective of a fictional character named Stuart Rand, a Gen Z writer born in the year 2000. What gave you the idea to kind of write backwards? What motivated you to write this piece the way you did?
Well, several reasons, but let me just kind of give you the bigger context of what happened here. Is when I was at Wired in the mid 90s, I don't know if you remember, Wired magazine was the first magazine to really understand the digital revolution was happening, really think very optimistic about the future coming out of what was essentially the new economy of these digital companies and thinking about the internet and the power of the internet. It was kind of the early place to do that. And I was among the early team there that was doing that. And I wrote a cover story in about the mid 90s, came out about 97 with a co-author, I will say, but basically I wrote it, which was essentially looking ahead for the next 20 years. And it was trying to say, well, how could these little goofball startups with names like Amazon that's just selling books, how are they ever going to run the global economy? Or Apple Computer at the time, by the way, the same month this cover story came out, Apple begged Steve Jobs to come back because they're about 3 months away from going bankrupt. And and in this piece, I was saying, well, it's you can't really see it yet, most people. But I'm telling you, once you connect up all these people on the internet, and once you start scaling this up, and once these little companies start growing, you're going to have a different world. And so we breathed life in this story to what would happen over the next 20 years. And the way I did it was I was using a historian in the future. It wasn't clear when he was writing it. It was kind of thought of maybe 2050 or something like that at the time. He was writing back about what happened to the story of the world from 1980 to 2020. And it was, again, written in the mid-90s. So the audience in the 90s was like, they understood what had come before, and we were referencing things in the past that was common knowledge. And then we were going forward to 20 years and 25 years out. And anyhow, that thing was very effective at the time, and it helped people at the time really understand the potential of these little goofball companies and how these things could really restructure the world. We also were talking about globalization and how China could go from, at the time in the mid-90s, was a knucklehead kind of developing world country with 800 million peasants. And we were saying, they could actually be, they're going to be another global superpower. Anyhow, we breathed life into this thing, which was largely prescient. And here it is, 2020. And it's pretty much played out. I mean, there are some things that are off, and we can kind of discuss that if we want to. But in general, the bigger story was right. And so here we are in 2020. And I thought, what if we did this again, going out to 2050, another 30 years, roughly the same kind of time? Wouldn't it be helpful for people to understand how AI is going to actually play out, or how genetic engineering, biological engineering is going to play out, or how the demographic changes in America are going to really play out, or different things that would. And in the process of this, I'm a positive guy. I'm an optimistic guy. I'm trying to think, how could we solve these challenges? And so, in thinking about that, instead of making it some dry historian of the future who you don't really know, I created a character, this guy Stuart Rand, and he's telling the story at the end of his life. He's 100 years old, which, by the way, all these Gen Zers who are born in around 2000 or late 90s and early 2000s and stuff, they're going to live 100 years and probably more, probably 120. The way they're thinking now is human bodies, through all our genetic understanding, our medical advances, what we're learning about food and health and all that. I mean, average people will live to be 100 and be vital, and they'll remember stuff, and they won't be the kind of what 100-year-olds are now. So I just said, hey, he's telling the story at the end of his life, looking back and saying, what happened to America primarily? We focus on America in this series, but also the world. What happened from 2020 to 2050, and how did we solve, or we call it turn the corner on climate change, because I don't know if it'll be fully solved. How did we deal with all this income inequality, and how do you deal with all the issues, racial inequities, all these things like bursting on the streets here in America this year? We were trying, and political polarization, everyone's kind of so despondent about how the country is torn apart right now. And I was just trying to lay out a positive but plausible way this could actually go, just to get people more thinking more clearly about what's possible here, instead of just being caught in despair and gloom and doom, and thinking the future is horrible. And so that was the idea behind it. And the device to do it is to use a character. And anyhow, that's why I did it.
Yeah, I love it. So you talk about, and this is really fascinating, because I just want to add to what you had just mentioned here in regards to your piece, because things can be rather frigid when you're just looking at it like you're listening to a futurist predict what's going to happen, or from a scientific perspective or from a technological perspective. But after I read your piece, it was something that really just drew me in, and I really just enjoyed reading it. One of the things that you talk about is the election of Donald Trump, and then the election of Biden, and the 2020 election. And you relate it to the defeat of Herbert Hoover after the Great Depression. As you know, FDR brought an incredibly progressive agenda to the country. But many progressives, they really find Biden to be kind of neoliberal, sort of Republican light. Do you see the Biden presidency as FDR-esque coming out of this COVID crisis, as an optimist? What is your perspective on that?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, let me put it this way: is what the story, when you're talking about the next 30 years, and you're also talking about what people are going to see in 2100. You think back, okay, how would we think of looking back to the perspective from 2100 to 2020 and the next 30 years is pretty much exactly what we are looking back on the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. So the 40 years there, or you could even say, yes, that's the kind of perspective we have. So did you know, you kind of know the basics of someone ran against FDR. Oh yeah, it was Hoover. Okay. But you don't remember every, newspaper article or a controversy or, policy or everything that they're fighting about. So it's kind of the broad lines story, but it's the one that really matters in the end of like, you remember, oh, I see we had this thing called the New Deal. Oh, after the war, we built this interstate highway system. Oh, I understand this. So, we eventually got someone on the moon, it took in by the late 60s. There's these big ideas, big things that happen that you see how the country evolved. So that's the kind of perspective, think of it the way I'm telling this story. So I get a little less into Biden and who's in the cabinet and what are the policies and the fights with the left and the right and all this stuff. Right. But I do think in the big picture, we could talk about it if you want, what I think about Biden outside of this story. But I think for the sense of the story, I do think that what we witnessed with the Biden election is comparable to what we saw back in that earlier period coming off of the Hoover and the kind of FDR transition. I'm explicitly not saying that Biden is like FDR at that kind of historic kind of.
You don't want to go there.
No, I'm not saying that. But I think it did happen, and it takes a little bit of explain to explain this, which is what really happened in terms of historical terms back in the 30s was essentially America was faced with two different visions of America. There was a very conservative, kind of business-oriented perspective on how to run the country, which had been going through the roaring 20s and with laissez-faire, hands-off kind of approaches. It led to the crash, basically, of the 1929 crash. And Herbert Hoover was a very conservative. He was a kind of, it turns out, the last of a line of a very conservative run of essentially presidents, but who through the 20s. But also kind of an approach to government and approach to how to run the country was essentially let business be business and just government should just stay out of everything else. Mm-hmm. What FDR did, and he was a fantastic politician. He went for 4, terms and stuff, which is not. Biden won't even live, another term or two. So it's not going to be that character. But what the country decided was we wanted to essentially shift the politics. We wanted to get it back more thinking about how did the average person make it through the Depression. We wanted to think about strengthening government to deal with the rise of fascism and these global challenges that we have to solve. But we needed America to be a leader in the world rather than kind of a isolationist or being kind of a national kind of just be nationalist isolationist, which is kind of where the conservative Republicans at that time were. And we made a decision. We want to move in this other direction. And I think, and then of course, FDR did roll with it. And the people who rolled out of that kept going with that idea. And the post-war boom kind of had strong government, high taxes, moving resources through society at a different way, kind of a progressive era, you'd think of it, the way we think of progressive as opposed to conservative. Right. And what I do think is going to be seen in history is I think America made that decision, even though it was very close, relatively speaking. It wasn't a landslide in one way or the other, which would have made it definitive. I think we actually made that decision. And I think what's going to happen is I think of Biden as a bridge. I don't think of him as the transformational leader, but I think he was the kind of what we needed to kind of get enough of a majority coalition saying, we don't want to go in this direction of Trump. We don't want to go in this direction of isolationism. We don't want to be this nationalist populist thing that's comparable to, these other right-wing folks around the world. That's not America. That's not where we want to go. We want to go in this other direction. And at the time, the guy who was the big tent, the guy who everyone could kind of say, yeah, he can at least turn the corner on this thing. It was Biden, but he's not the guy that's going to do it. And that's why I think Kamala and I think, the next generation of leaders that he's assembling, Pete Buttigieg and all kinds of people in his cabinet, I think really from the historical perspective, the 2020s will be driven not by the Joe Biden vision, but it's essentially a next generation progressive vision, progressive in a kind of a historical terms, again, in a big picture way, not like, because I know within the party, there's like, Medicare for all or this, or is it, defund the police or that. I mean, progressive, there is a sense of progressive within the Democrats, but I think from the bigger point of view of the country or his way we look at it historically, all the Democrats, Blue America is essentially the progressive direction of where the country is going to go, I would argue. And we can explain why and why this election marks it. I mean, no one was worried about California turning red or New York turning red. But Texas, they were worried about Texas turning blue, and Georgia did turn blue. And in fact, you guys down in Florida there, it's still close. A 50-50 thing. But that trend is not trending the other way. It's trending away from the red creep in the country. That happened in the last 40 years. That was the story of the last 40 years in America, was essentially more of a conservative era. But now I think we're in essentially a different era, which is this is the cusp of the era. Trump kind of brought the end. I don't know where your own politics are exactly, or your listeners, but I think, in my opinion, and strong opinion, I think Trump marked the end of essentially a conservative era that kind of run from Ronald Reagan, who brought it in and was at that time was very energizing and really transformational in his way. But Trump kind of was the last end of that and kind of alienated a lot of the constituencies of the 21st century, young people being particularly the millennial generation and the Gen Zs. And I think that crew is now going to drive the political conversation going forward. And I think increasingly it's going to be obvious this is where we're moving in the 2020s here. And so I was just making that call because I think in the future they're going to see that very clearly. Oh, that was the flip. The flip happened in that 2020 election.
Right. And I thought very similarly as well. Like when we talk about the 2020 election and Biden being the president-elect, I think it was a very clear decision that we were moving away from the nationalist populism. But as you said, it wasn't a landslide victory. And so the fact that we are, it took a crisis. It took COVID, really. I think Trump would have won the 2020 election had it not been for COVID. And so, I don't see Biden either as this FDR character, but I really appreciate the light or the fact that your piece steps back so far. Because it allows us to take this more historical view where it's not just like, AOC versus the neoliberals, like this narrative that it seems to be all the Democratic Party is talking about right now, which is, kind of unfortunate, but I understand, where it's coming from and why. We need real progressives that are going to, move the agendas that we're talking about. But let's go back to your piece a little bit more, because I think that there's so much in here that inspired me about the next, 10, 20, 30 years. You talk about the baby boomer generation being mostly conservative, the millennials being far more progressive, but they're not getting they're not eating as in the way that the baby boomers were, economically speaking. Gen Z, kind of the next group of people, the next generation that's taking the mantle of progressive values. And you see them as you see Gen Z as the ultimately the transformers of our society, ultimately, based on your piece. It's no surprise that the older generations generally lean conservative, the younger generations lean more liberal. Why do you think Gen Z is ultimately going to be the generation that beats climate change, beats racial injustice, beats income inequality? Why do you see that being the case?
Well, happy to talk about that. It's a great point. But the first thing I want to do to kind of just talk about this generational thing is this is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about and working on for literally the last probably 25 years. One of the misconceptions about generations is that all generations start out more liberal and they all end up conservative. That actually isn't the case, and there's a bunch of data-driven ways to explain this. But for example, the GI generation, the generation that won World War II and then later was like JFK was one of the presidents who was a GI generation. That generation who came of age in the 30s and were kind of the young generation for FDR, got behind the FDR and the New Deal, and they were the ones that kept playing out with the long, post-war boom. That crew voted liberal Democrat. They called them liberal at the time, but let's think of it as progressive Democrat. They voted that way their entire lives to the end of it. Now, again, with any generation, there's always going to be differentiation. There's always some conservatives in a progressive generation, and there's always some progressives in a conservative generation. But most generations, all generations, from where they come of age, with how they grew up, what was the world they were in, all kinds of different things, shape essentially a personality of a generation, and that personality has a political perspective. And so, that perspective, after about 3 elections, they say, this is literally the academic stuff that gets nailed down, is after a generation votes about 3 elections, they pretty much stick with the way they think, like that political party that they've been kind of groomed into, that they'll stick for it for life. And so, for example, the Generation X, which is the generation it was a small generation that came after the boomers.
We're Generation X, right?
You're Generation X. Now,
I'm pretty sure, right?
I think so. You are. Well, I know you look probably
70.
We're in that missing little area. Remember, like 77, they call it like the Star Wars generation.
Right. So you're 78. You're 77. I'm 79. Yeah. So I think we are Generation X, but we're like right in between. Like we weren't born with the internet. We were that little, that little piece in between the boomer and the millennial. Yeah. So.
Well, a lot of it, again, there's always a differentiation, but the majority of Gen X, and this still polls consistently, they came of age in the Reagan kind of era and that kind of conservative era. They tended to be, and they tended to vote more Republican and conservative, and they basically were more entrepreneurial. They were all kinds of stuff. They were the people that kind of built the internet, the early internet, all kinds of stuff. And there's a lot of great things coming out of that generation. But I will say their politics, if you really look at it, they are still voting. They are the core block, essentially, for the Republicans to this day. And in fact, they're not changing. And they weren't that progressive in the 80s and 90s when they were kind of coming up. So anyhow, the long and short of it is, that's one thing I just want to be clear is, it's not that the generations change. It's that they actually come of age and get kind of fixed and they go on. Now, if that's the case.
So you're saying millennial, you don't see the millennials shifting to a conservative.
No. Not at all. I don't. Okay. And I don't. And in fact, I'm not the only guy saying this. There's a very consistent way to think about this from other. Now take it for the other way is the boomers. This is a good example because everyone says, well, my parents are super, progressive hippies, kind of who were boomers, right? There's clearly about 40% of boomers who you would call, progressive or liberal or Democrats. Right. But about 60%, the majority, which is kind of the overwhelming majority, tend to be more conservative and have been for many years. They were they were kind of driving the last 40 years of politics, essentially. Newt Gingrich and, that whole crew and, Bush. And I mean, there was a whole conservative thing in the boomers. So yes, you can see others that weren't, but the dominant idea of that era was essentially anti-government, pro-business, a bunch of the stuff you'd associate with more of a conservative thing. And so anyhow, what I'm saying is with the millennials, and you can look at it in the current polling, and you guys have probably studied this around, just even this last election, is they're just overwhelmingly for, you would call it progressive Democratic kind of points of view. I mean, they were the Bernie Sanders people behind it. They were like, there's no question about climate change. They're totally into diverse society. They're kind of, anyhow, all the kind of stuff about, white supremacy drives them nuts. And anyhow, they also don't have much at stake economically. They can't even buy homes in these cities and stuff. So they're kind of more economically open to more, distributed policies and tax higher folks who have more money and do more public investment stuff. Anyhow, in general, now again, there's a good chunk of the millennials who are not thinking that, but the majority are. So what's interesting about the political thing here is Gen Z, which by the way, in my pieces, I renamed just because ultimately they're going to get renamed. Gen Z won't stick. Well, just like the millennials were called Gen Y for a while, and then they got And so anyhow, you can debate what the name will, but let's just call them Gen Z for now because that's what people think.
Well, I'd actually like for you to, I'd actually like for you to reveal the name that you give them in the article because I think it's fantastic.
I call them the regeneration, as in regenerate or, reinvent or, you kind of renew. I mean, there's a bunch of ways you can play with that, but I call them the regeneration, R-E and then capital G generation, the regeneration. And I think it's a fun name. And I think it actually, and also there's a lot of people talking about regenerative economics and agriculture and all kinds of stuff. So there's a bunch of ways to think about that. But, that's me playing with, who knows what it'll be in the end. But I will say this, I bet you for sure that generation will be named something that won't be Z. Gen X, it's stuck.
Right.
The millennials were Gen Y for a while, and then finally they became a moniker that made more sense. It's kind of felt better, and I'm convinced it'll be the same. It happens with all these generations. No one really knows what to call them at first, and then they get a personality, and you say, "Oh, they're that." Anyhow, for whatever they're called, what's remarkable about the Gen Zers is that they're very almost perfectly aligned with the millennials. And so even though you said earlier when you framed my question to me, you were saying it more about Gen Z will be the generation that'll kind of save the day and drive the changes of the 21st century. I actually think of it, the more accurate way to say the way I think of it is you're watching an alignment of two very big generations that are essentially aligned in their politics. They both, for example, there's no question in that almost anyone in those generations, they don't question climate change. They're not climate deniers. They worry about climate change. They're also they embrace diversity. Both those generations are about 50% minorities. Everybody has diverse friends, all that kind of stuff. They're not the kind of, unlike the boomers who basically are totally white, basically. I mean, very few people of color in the whole boomer thing, which is why they don't have the same sensibility. But anyhow, those two generations, I'm positing in this piece, or series of pieces, are going to drive a more transformative agenda for American politics. Because I'll just tell you this, every single year, every single day, let me put it this way, every day, 10,000 boomers are retiring from the workforce. And there's a significant number, I won't quantify it, are dying every day because they're reaching that part of life in their 70s and stuff. And every day, all these Gen Zs are graduating, are turning 18, and coming out of college and going into the workforce and doing the whole thing. When you get those two generations lined up and fully firing on all cylinders, which is going to happen this decade, that's going to define the agenda of this country. And I think that's something people are not anticipating. And when that happens, you will have a situation similar to what happened coming off World War II, which is essentially the great boom that came off of the war, was essentially driven by different attitudes towards what are you going to do with strong government? How are you going to invest in public infrastructure? How are you going to spread the wealth differently? How are you going to support the middle class rather than the upper class? Anyhow, there were a lot of principles that came out of that era that I think are going to have analogs to this one. And that's what I was doing when I laid that out. So that's a long answer, but that's kind of what I was trying to say of that.
Yeah, I love it. So you go on to write, and this I'm going to quote you here. The technology world had a real opportunity to redeem itself through this crisis too, talking about COVID-19. The companies had started the previous era of the digital revolution as scrappy startups, but a handful of them ended the era as the most valuable corporations in the world. As they grew in power, they had drawn increasing criticism and eventually a public backlash in what at the time was called the techlash. I love how you named that. The pandemic opened a path for them to provide crucial technology and show real leadership by letting go of their monopolistic business models and returning to their roots of open, interoperable, decentralized systems. They also had an opportunity to use the economic heft to pioneer new ways of treating workers and communities and help shape a new form of stakeholder capitalism, which they did. So now, this is an incredibly hopeful perspective. The current sentiment toward social media companies and big tech is of extreme suspicion, with money driving every activity and nothing socially positive about social media. They tend to behave like monopolies. How do you reconcile your extremely hopeful outlook on these tech companies and this potential for new capitalism with how people currently feel about, these companies and, government? Our government is going after a lot of these companies for antitrust, and they're trying to, force them to do the right thing. What makes you think they're just gonna do the right thing?
Well, the short answer is they're not going to just do it. There's going to be pressure. let me do this. Let me step back from this for a second. So, and I'm laying out my perspective here, my cards.
Right.
But I came out to Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area literally kind of mid 90s, in the early days of the internet. I mean, literally, we were trying to explain, what's email and what's the web and that kind of level of stuff to folks. And so, and because of the situation of San Francisco and Wired and all that kind of stuff, I've been, privileged or something, or you could say lucky at some level, to have spent a lot of time with a lot of tech people and a lot of founders and a lot of famous people and a lot of people that have gone from, goofball, coders to like billionaires, right?
Right.
And I would say, and this, I'm not the only guy to say this, is that that they don't know. I mean, that the transformation in that industry happened so fast that they didn't even know what hit them. I mean, at some level, they essentially were literally just knucklehead goofball coders and idealistic young people and all this in the 90s. And even in the 2000s, remember the whole .com crash? It just decimated the whole tech world. And everyone was just picking up the pieces in the early 2000s. And these companies, they loved what they're doing, and they wanted to change the world, and we wanted to kind of, they had all that stuff. They did also want to make money, but it wasn't like their whole idea was just all about money and we'll screw everybody and we don't care. But they actually did have a lot of idealism, and they had a lot of sense of what's going on. And so you watch this thing happen, and that idealism, just you go back just 5 years, folks. I mean, the American public loved the tech companies.
Right.
People love their technology. They loved, oh my God, Apple is awesome, and oh my God, at Google, you can just put in a word and find everything. Like, oh my God, and Amazon's giving me stuff home. It's like I can shop for anything. I mean, just put it in context, which is the backlash only happened when they got so successful that they ended up dominating the entire global economy, and their valuations went from, healthy companies, in comparison to the oil industry or financial industry or Wall Street. I mean, there were comparable powers that be out there, right? And now they're just like bigger than that. So basically, when you become that powerful and that wealthy and that, kind of lucky at some level,
and in such a short period of time.
In such a short period of time, everybody hates you. Of course, everybody. I mean, everyone wants to kill you, basically. So there's a level of this which is just like whatever industry is going to go through that is going to be feared and hated very quickly. And so there's a kind of a thing that just happens when you grow that fast. And I would say internally, these same people that started 20 years ago, I gave you this little comparison of just 20 years ago, what would have happened if COVID hit? Just 20 years ago, Jeff Bezos was literally worth barely nothing, and in fact, I'll just tell you, I was at Burning Man. He was like in my camp. He crawled out of his tent one morning, and it was like this dude, just as like normal dude, kind of like, who is this guy? And his wife was there. In fact, it was funny. He was all outfitted in an REI kind of outfit of they just bought all this new equipment to kind of come together. Everybody was kind of like, who are these guys? Oh, he runs this thing called Amazon. Okay, that's cool. Anyhow, the point is, so they're just normal people, right? And then now they're running the world. So anyhow, there is a thing about those same brains, those same people are kind of gone through. Now, the other thing that's going on is the tech industry isn't just run by a few entrepreneurs, right? They have these young people who flock to San Francisco from not just all over the country, but all over the world. And they're into making money, but they're also really idealistic, and they're horrified, frankly, that Facebook is being used to genocide on the other side of the planet. I mean, who's happy about that? So anyhow, there is a kind of a mortification going on here. So what I'm just laying out here is from what I'm seeing from inside and also from the outside. What I think is going to happen in the next decade here is you're not going to see a fight to the death of tech fighting every step of the way and, death, to the last minute. I think they're actually going to be open to a regulation. They're going to be open to, things that kind of let them be less responsible for everything. Now, some of them, like Facebook, might hang on to the bitter end and might have to be, broken up, or, something that's going to have to send a lesson from the outside, which I think is healthy. Society should not be run by corporations. It should be a collective. Government should set the tone. And, if we have to break up some, fine. If we have to regulate some, fine. If we have to kind of find some, great. That happens. And I think that's healthy. But I will say this, is I think the tech world is going to be a more constructive partner in creating this world, solving climate change, dealing with inequalities and stuff. And I think there's a lot of signs they're already kind of doing that, certainly as compared to other industries. So just let's put it in context. It's like the oil industry, if let's say another comparable big industry, well, they're still, fighting climate denial, and they're basically, trying to undermine everything. Is like, are those guys better or worse than tech? No, tech is better in that way. They're at least trying to do some of the right things. Wall Street, it's like those dudes have been overcompensated to just crazy extremes, and the billionaires are kind of ruining half of our, the pop, the kind of the society, the social fabric by all these fabulous things. Now, some of those billionaires are tech people, but a lot of those people are like plowing it back into other stuff. But basically, Wall Street is another industry that, give me a break. It's like how superior is them to like the tech world. So I think over time, you're going to see that they're a new and a young and an emerging kind of industry, powerful industry, just like past parts of history. We watch, Standard Oil and the oil companies kind of run shit and be the robber barons for a while. The railroad companies were the big up and comers, and they, everyone hated them for a long time. And there's these, once you kind of get an industry that goes that kind of huge and powerful, it's always going to get a backlash. But if we do the right thing from the outside, government and others, and I think there's going to be a lot more goodwill internally than you think. They're not going to fight this to the death, is my opinion. I think they're actually going to understand, with all these lawsuits and breakup and antitrust, and people hate them, and they go to a cocktail party and everyone says, you work for we hate you. It's like they're gonna not want to live in that world. So that's that. And I will say one last thing about this, which is a bigger picture way to think about capitalism and stakeholder capitalism, is to be fair to them. And I'm not kind of just purely just defending this, but to be fair, they were small companies coming into a system that incentivized all the returns to go to shareholders.
Right.
That was the rules of capitalism. That was the rules of the game. That's how the business was played. So when these guys started forming companies, and they're almost all guys, they were just saying, okay, those are the rules. We'll do those rules. And they're competitive, and they fought, and boom, they ended up with these companies that supercharged, returns to their shareholders. But I don't think they're necessarily wedded to that. I think if we actually change the rules around things, they wouldn't be, okay, fine, we'll work in a different. I mean, I think they're going to resist it at some level, but I think they would come around to evolving the rules of the game of capitalism to spread the wealth differently, to make sure that only the founders and the VCs and the shareholders get engorged with this wealth. I think they know there's plenty of wealth to move through, and then eventually I think they could come around, and that's kind of what happened. One last point about this, the auto industry, for example, coming off World War II, was essentially the tech companies of that age. They were super powerful companies. They just built tanks and planes and, the cars, and were just starting to open up with the interstate highway. But they basically realized that they had to cut a deal with labor, and they had to play ball with the United States government. And they basically did that by creating the kind of labor kind of commitments that became the norm for all of America. But, there was no vacation before the, post-war boom. There was no, really weekends off. You never got a pension. You didn't get all these things that we take as the norms now in American society, essentially not driven by government. Government did not force that. It was essentially the tech titans of that time, in that case, auto industry, basically thought in their interest to cut a deal with labor and just say, okay, cool. There's enough to go around here. You guys will pay you well. We'll give you cost of living periods. There was negotiations, and the unions had to fight for it too. But in general, they came around to it because they realized the long-term play was more interesting and better for everybody. I think tech is going to see it that way in the next 10 years here, and I think we're going to watch essentially a social contract kind of deal being dealt with this. And that's idealistic, but I think it's worth thinking about before we get too freaked out.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think it's definitely worth contemplating and thinking about and trying to figure out, again, you said that, the labor had to fight, to get those things, but eventually those organizations, those companies realized that if they were going to be successful, move forward, grow, and they needed their workforce to be engaged, to be positive, to be energetic, and to be focused. And it's very difficult to do that when you're treating your labor force like shit.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'll just make one other point about that. Is once the deal was cut amongst the leading companies at that time, which had the resources and all that to do it generously, which was the auto industry, that model became a model for all industries almost.
Right.
And then it did get reinforced by the U.S. government that, you had to, guarantee vacation, and you had to pay overtime, and you had to, those became laws, but they were not started as laws imposed on the leading companies, the tech companies at that time. They were essentially modeled after the innovations that tech world, the auto industry, had done with labor. And so it was not just, the tech people did well, the auto industry did well. Everybody did well. We're all kind of a product of that generous kind of reworking of the social contract, the labor contract of essentially that came off the 40s into the 50s. And I think that's the same thing here. Is I think what's going to have to get innovated was not just, okay, you work for Google, you're going to get a good deal. That's pretty clear now. A lot of people do that. But I think it's going to model that all these little companies then will start thinking, okay, well, yeah, that's how we got to deal with it. Okay, maybe a worker has to be on the board. Okay, maybe we have to give equity to contract workers, not just, other stakeholders. Anyhow, there's a bunch of things you could imagine going in detail, but I'm saying it won't be just for them and their employees. It'll model for the rest, and that's where I think the potential goes.
Right.
Anyhow,
this is really interesting here. One of the predictions that you make is that the American heartland, the red states in America, you see them going blue over the next 10, 15 years. One of the things that made me question is, okay, well, why do you think that is? And one of the things that you kind of hit on in your article or in your piece is that people can now work from anywhere, right? And so there's all this undervalued land. People are able to work from anywhere. You're going to see people in these higher cost of living states moving to these rural communities. Like, are you thinking that's the sole reason, or do you think there are multiple reasons where you're actually going to see this happen? And will it be an actual rejuvenation of the heartland, or will it be more like you'll just see like giant tech centers pop up?
Good question. But I have a couple of good ways to answer that, actually. So there's several things going on here. And I'm actually going to draw off of another series I did in Medium a couple of years ago, which you and I have chatted about before this. Was called California's the Future.
Right.
I did a piece about a series of 4 articles, long kind of magazine-like articles, similar to this package of 6 stories, magazine-like stories I'm doing called The Transformation Now. Anyhow, the gist of that was essentially telling the story that California has always kind of prefigured American politics by about 10 to 15 years. There's a way to analyze this. I can explain it later. But in general, think of it as that California tends to experience the future first. And it tends to be extremely entrepreneurial and kind of innovative. And so a lot of things happen there that kind of travel through the country differently. I mean, you can see it with Technologies, obviously, we've seen it many times. You can see it with cultural trends. You can see it with a bunch of social stuff, and a lot of things that America has experienced has kind of come out of the California stuff. Just to say it, I know you're in Florida, and I know that it bugs the East Coast people, but
it sheds a lot of light on my childhood because I was born in California, in San Diego, and then my parents got the bright idea to move back to the Midwest when I was 7 years old, and I was a very, very unhappy child.
There you go.
You had a taste. You had a taste of that kind of like innovation, freedom, cultural opportunity and awareness. And real quick, I just want to add this to your point, and it's very interesting because California has always been, you've always had New York, which is a cultural hub, but California has always been kind of this. It's almost like a testing site when it comes to new cultural ideas. You talk about the Summer of Love. You talk about all these different things. They really took their stride in California. One of the interesting things also that I noticed in your TED Talk was you talked about even the resurgence of conservatism came out of California, and I think a lot of Gen Zers and millennials may not realize that Ronald Reagan was elected governor, and then he made it to the national stage, and like there was this real resurgence of conservatism in California that then spread across the country after years after FDR. I just find that completely fascinating.
Well, yeah. So the quick version of that, which is absolutely true. So California has this prefigures the future of America in a bunch of ways, including.
Are you saying what are you saying? Prefigurative?
Prefigure. They prefigure the future.
Okay.
Meaning they kind of do it first. They do the first draft, and then it comes the rest of the country. But anyhow, Reagan's a great example. People forget this. California was a totally red state. It essentially invented modern conservatism. Reagan was governor in the 60s with his kind of kind of more conservative stuff. And he became president in 80. So it was basically like a 15-year kind of time delay from him becoming. By the way, and before that, California had been very progressive, kind of, and then Reagan brought this conservative thing. Then a bunch of stuff happened. The tax revolt, everyone, the cut taxes kind of frenzy, that all started in California. It was a big tax revolt of 1978, and eventually went national. But it takes about 10, 15 years to filter out to where everybody in, Georgia and, Wisconsin and everybody else is doing this stuff. So there's this time delay thing. Well, so it was red, then it became red and blue together, paralyzed, kind of like America's Day. This happened about the kind of late 90s and the early 2000s, where it's basically a failed state. Nothing could happen. We couldn't pass budgets. We couldn't solve anything. It was a 50-50 state, which is, what is that? That's kind of where the U.S. has been, right? Again, 15 years late. What happened in California, though, is starting in 2005, literally 15 years ago, there was essentially a Waterloo. That was the last stand of California. I'm here in California, so I can kind of tell this story. It was the last stand of conservatism, and it basically was also the beginnings of the progressive kind of California. And so it's only in the last 15 years that California has turned into this deep blue thing that everyone says, oh, it's this crazy kind of progressive thing, and thinking that it's always been that way. No, that's not true. It went through this big change. Why? They actually realized, hey, climate change is real. We got to start doing stuff about this. They realized they had a more diverse society. They had, more than 50% of their society were people of color, and they're saying, instead of, we can't be like, we got to embrace it. We got to start dealing with this. And so they kind of decided, we're going to do something about this, and a variety of all kinds of stuff that, we got to start taxing the rich again. We got to spread the wealth differently. Anyhow, a bunch of progressive things started in that thing. Now, nationally, the Republicans, for example, say, oh, that crazy California world. It's like that thing happened in response to the realities of the 21st century and a bunch of new things, and the demographic changes of the country, including younger people coming to that state and all that stuff. Anyhow, what I'm saying is this has now happened without people really realizing it. It's happened through the United States. Now, and we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier in this conversation, but let's just review here for folks a second. What really happened in this election was the Democrats have swept through the entire Southwest now of the United States. That region, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, was all conservative. The senators, the governors, everybody, and they
Right.
voted it in all the presidential elections. And what happened this year? All of them were blue, and all the senators were blue, by the way, too. They've essentially now, that same phenomenon that had happened in California is now sweeping through the Southwest, and it already is sweeping into Texas. I'm predicting by 2024, it's probably, Texas is going to be a true battleground. And it's very possible to flip presidentially into the blue camp in 2024. When that happens, it's game over. There's no way, zero way the Republicans can win without Texas, which is a huge, I mean, California's bigger, but without Texas, they can't go anywhere. And then it flipped the deep South. It flipped Georgia. That's unprecedented. I mean, it's like that hasn't happened forever, right? So I'm just saying what's happening in the country is happening demographically. It's happening through the people of color, through younger people, through facing up to climate change, all these kind of issues that essentially are kind of more the inequalities thing are just getting to the point where people have to deal with it. So anyhow, that's happening, whether you like it or not, and it's coming around to us. And so if you look again from the future, when they see the big long strokes of things, they're going to look back and say, that's what happened. We just saw kind of that thing that happened in California. Now it went national and it started to go. And then that thing will lock in my opinion, it'll lock in essentially a 60% majority that allows you to do things with super majorities of legislatures, like California, for example. There is literally not one single Republican in statewide office, and there is super majorities in the state house and the state senate, which can basically, whatever the Democrats want to do, they can do now. And it's a very progressive state, so they're starting to do crazy big things, right? That is going to happen to America, I'm thinking, over time. Now, it's still going to have, it's hard to know whether, not every region is going to turn blue. But I mean, anyhow, the point is there'll be a 60% majority, and that'll allow the country in the coming decades to, instead of fighting over everything and, one guy gets in and Trump comes in and he undoes everything that Obama does and Biden undoes everything that Trump could do. That's what happens when you get split government, 50-50 world, nothing gets done. Once you go into supermajorities, or when I say supermajorities, it's not crazy numbers. It's just 60% of the people say, we're going to do this. We're not going to fight about it anymore. It's like climate change is real. We're not going to have this fucking fight. We've had it for 25 years. It's like, we're not going to have this fight anymore. It's just nuts. And anyhow, that's what happened in California. It's like, nobody, it's not just a joke. Nobody, what do you mean there's no climate change? Everybody, it's just the people talking like that, they're in this little kind of corner. We just say, okay, fine, you people do that thing. It's like, we don't even listen to you anymore. Anyhow, that's going to happen nationally, I would say, in that kind of level. And so what's going to do is clear the space for transformational change, big changes, long-term investments, things multi-decade kind of plays. And that's the kind of thing we're going to need to solve these challenges that we've talked about. Climate change, changing the nature of capitalism. I mean, these things, getting beyond political polarization, these are huge changes, but we have them in our ability to do this now, because now it's not going to happen literally this week because, Mitch McConnell might still control the Senate by one vote, whatever. That might happen for another year or two or something, even of just craziness like that. But ultimately, the writing's on the wall. And I will challenge anyone on the other side. You give me one good scenario of how red America is going to roll back to a 60% majority against the coasts, blue America states, the urban centers with all the dynamic economy, young people growing in numbers, people of color which aren't going home, they're not going back to their shithole countries, all that kind of stuff. That's just not going to happen. That world is gone. That world is done. It's a 20th century world. There's a crew that's hanging on to it. They're freaked out. The future's coming. Game over, folks.
Yeah, I always thought this was Trump was like the last throes of this uber nationalism, white supremacy kind of movement. I always just kind of felt that in my bones. And it was a little scary that he could have won again in 2020, but he didn't. And I really think, again, going back to the previous conversation, I think COVID had a big, a part in that. But the fact that things are like we can't get anything done right now. Like it's almost impossible, and we have all of the Democrats are at each other's throats about Biden's cabinet and this, that, and the other. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time in the microcosm, because I think that this conversation is so valuable to me, and I think probably our listeners, because we are talking bigger picture and we are talking visionary stuff, and let's figure out where we're actually going over the long term. Yeah, and we're gonna have to fight the little fights in the meantime, but I think it's important to kind of scale back and think about this bigger perspective. So I want to go back to another piece of your writing. You say, if only we could have seen back then what everyone today in 2100 can see with long lens of historical perspective. The 2020s brought the start of a massive tech boom carried out simultaneously in three different directions. Infotech roughly doubled its reach in the space of 1 decade, adding 3 billion people to the internet by 2030. At that point, everyone in the world was connected via the internet to the global economy and society, and to ubiquitous AI technology. Few anticipated how AI-enabled simultaneous language translation would accelerate innovation by cross-connecting people and ideas from every corner of the planet. I literally have goosebumps as I'm reading this. This idea, so basically what you're saying is that this idea that AI and the technology that we're evolving is going to give us the ability to plug in all of these people, these brilliant minds. Like, I think one of the most underestimated things about what the underdeveloped world is the amount of talent, the amount of intelligence, the amount of passion, the amount of interest, the amount of exceptionalism that's going to be flowing out of what we quote unquote call the third world. We just had an interview on Tuesday with a gentleman out of Sri Lanka. His name is Indy, and like, this dude is so fucking talented and intelligent, and like, there are so many intelligent people who just aren't connected yet, but by time they get connected, it's going to be powerful. And then, but you add in this extra layer of artificial intelligence. We're going to have the ability for me to be having a conversation with somebody like you who's in a country that does not speak English. We're going to be able to immediately, in real time, have this conversation and be working together. You can do it on a cool podcast, or you can be working on a vaccine, or you can be working on the next technological innovation. The power and growth of that, plus quantum computing. I mean, my mind is literally scrambled with the possibilities that we're about to see over the next 10 years. It's phenomenal, isn't it?
No, I love it. I love your energy, and I love how you go there, because I'm the same way. I just at some level it kind of drives you. It just energizes you.
Yeah, I'm itching, man. I'm itching. It's like, it's so close. It's so fucking close.
Kristen, you gotta keep really itching.
She's going to grab me another cocktail to keep me under control. So it should be okay.
Actually, I'm enjoying my beer here. I loved how you brought this up, because you're right. You can go into politics, and it drives, you can go deep on politics. My own view of history, and I'm a guy who spent a lot of time thinking about history, long view history. I'm a big history buff, as well as a future kind of guy. But, technologies, to really understand what goes on in a society, and you really have to kind of start off, what were the technologies they had? Like, what are the tools they had? Like, so if you go back to the Roman Empire, okay, what did they have then? You go back further, you got to figure out, did they have fire? Did they know how to do bronze? You got to go back to the Enlightenment. You kind of go, well, did they even understand electricity? Actually, they didn't. But, they did understand the Earth went around the sun. That was a big move. Anyhow, there's just a level of kind of understanding where people are. But also for technologies, like, what could people do? And so I think in the future, they'll look back and they'll say, okay, one way to start thinking about that is you got to think, well, what are the technologies they have? And the kind of, I guess you could say their scientific understanding, but I would just say, start with the tools. And people today really underestimate or underappreciate the unbelievable power of these tools. So let me just put it this way. In 2000, I mentioned to you, basically no one on the planet except for about a third of Americans were online, right? And now we've got about 60% of the planet is online in the space of 20 years, which in a world historical context is mind blowing.
It's a blink.
It's a blink in the eye, and you kind of go, oh, so you went from a place where no one could talk instantaneously with everybody to 4.5 billion people could do that. Wow, that's a big deal. So, but it's going to get an even bigger deal because it is inevitable. I call them the inexorables, but this one you can say is inevitable. That basically everybody on the planet will be connected over high bandwidth connections to powerful devices like smartphones and stuff that'll by that time, by the end of the decade, let's say by 2030, it'll be literally nothing. And if they'll be so cheap that we'll just give it to people that are really dirt poor. But anyhow, the point being is you're going to have 8 billion people on the planet who are accessed with high bandwidth connections over the world from a time, and 30 years before that, 2000, nobody was. That's in the world history. That's like a freaking big deal, right? So that's one thing. The second thing, which is amazing about it, is the evolution of AI on top of that, which is you will able to, not only are we just going to be able to just connect, which is a big enough deal to do video like this,
right?
But then you'll be able to actually, this simultaneous language translation is a huge deal for a bunch of reasons. But one reason is it's happening. The fastest computers now, the most powerful computers, are outperforming humans in natural language translation in real time. So computers can do that. They happen to be very powerful now, but that always happens in tech, and just let it play out. Anyhow, by the end of this decade, or even mid-decade or something, we'll be getting it pretty workable. That you're right. I could be speaking in Farsi from Iran, or I could be speaking Chinese from Guangzhou, or I could be talking, Swahili, from Kenya or something, and you would totally understand me, right? I mean that's awesome. A kind of a bizarre thing. And you go traveling, you have a little earbud like this, and you'll just go traveling in an Indian bazaar, and you'll talk to the person, and they'll totally hear you, and you'll hear them, and you'll just kind of like, oh, cool, and you'll have this conversation. Anyhow, that just alone is a big deal. But innovation, if you go one notch deeper, what is innovation? Innovation is essentially a product of the cross-fertilization of ideas and many different, particularly multidisciplinary perspectives on a problem. So often people get stuck in their silos of kind of, their expertise. They go deep into a field. That's the way most people kind of do their careers, or what they do.
And let me just add to that.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry. Just let me add to that, because that's something that's been uniquely, I would say, like European and American. Like we have the specialty position is an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution, right? It's like you focus on your nut, and you screw your nut, or you screw your bolt, or you do this and you do that, and you just focus. And it's like we have neuroscientists, and we have childhood psychologists, and the biggest problem we have with all those all those domains is that they don't talk to each other well. So I just wanted to lay the context on what you're saying, because hopefully you were getting to a solution.
Well, no. What I actually am getting to a solution, which
right.
is when you actually have innovation in a company. I mean, and a lot of what I do now is I'm working inside companies and all kinds of stuff, and helping people see cross connect across fields. Sounds like you're like this too. I'm a generalist. I'm a guy curious about a million things. I'm always kind of cross-connecting people. I know people in all kinds of fields. That's what I do. I interview folks and events and all kinds of stuff, the way you kind of seem to be doing with this podcast. Anyhow, we're kind of a minority, but there's a value in that. But what comes out of the cross-connects is innovation, new ideas. Right. It's like, oh, the physicist sees it from the neurosciences, and they go, oh, well, that means we can do this. Anyhow, that's just generally what the innovation is. Now, the second thing I want to say, though, which is really important about where we are in history, is innovation has gone from an art, like, wow, a Michelangelo or an Einstein or somebody just, genius or something, or, an art, but now to a science. So innovation has gone from an art to a science. And so meaning in the last 20 to 30 years, businesses have kind of studied it so deeply, and academia has studied it so deeply, that we kind of get now how to accelerate innovation, how innovation works, how to scale up innovation. There's a whole thing called design thinking. I don't know how some people maybe have heard that on this thing. Anyhow, there's a bunch of ways. There's books now about iterative processes and prototyping and how fast, fail fast. And anyhow, there's a bunch of ways that particularly the tech world is all over this thing. So what's happened now is at a time when everyone's connected, you're cross-connecting everybody. We know how to innovate better than ever before. It's like a science rather than it's art. we have no idea what, at some level, how much crazy stuff is going to get figured out, and amazing innovations are going to happen, probably for good and bad. It's not all going to be good in the next coming decades. And so I think it's that thing that people are underappreciating is the level of innovation we're heading into. Now people talk about, oh, time's accelerating and things are happening fast, but this is true, and I think we have to really get ready for it. And I think here's my 2 points that I would basically tell the people here, and I'm developing a talk that's going to come out. I'm going to be doing actually online streamed for people in early February, which is another matter. But basically, I've come up with 2 things. I've been thinking is never bet against human ingenuity. Never underestimate what human beings, human ingenuity can come up with. And also never underestimate the power of new tools. I mean, I think these 2 things together, if we really think about it, so people are wringing their hands, oh, we'll never solve climate change. Oh, we'll never solve this. We'll never solve that. And everyone's in gloom and doom, and it's like fearing the future, all that stuff. Well, the problem is, or one of the things is, it's like there are so many. We're entering a period of incredible potential based on our ability to basically innovate and leverage these insanely powerful tools. And I think that's something that we should take heart in. We should be wary of, because things can be innovated in difficult directions too. But in general, I think it's something that people haven't even wrapped their heads around. And that's why I think I'm very bullish and have a very can-do attitude that I think we're going to actually solve these big challenges, which is really the name of the game now. It's climate change.
Yeah, Mike's waiting on the replicator.
I believe that I believe that this is a fundamental belief of mine, is that when we come up with the replicator, when we actually invent the replicator, and because I think this is something interesting that we talk about a lot on this show, is that we do have the resources to feed the world. Like, the resources are there. We just don't have the distribution networks, and we don't have the incentives, right? You need to get people to do things, you need to incentivize them. And in order to execute, you need an infrastructure. And we just don't have that. But once we get the replicator, then we can actually, there's no doubt that we can that scarcity will be gone. And once scarcity is gone, you don't have the sorts of needs for control that dominate darker times and darker politics. That being said, Kristen always makes fun of me because she says, well, can the replicator replicate a puppy?
It's an old joke with a friend of mine. The point was that if the replicator can replicate yogurt, then it should be able to replicate a puppy.
Right, live cultures. So I do want to, and this is one thing that I really appreciated about your writing, that you don't just paint this kind of utopic socialist view, and I'm very for like social programs. I'm a very progressive person. I don't believe there's any. I don't think you should. Like, I don't think in order to get the human spirit to thrive, like, they should be at the threat of starvation. Like, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's necessary. I think that's a bullshit argument that Reagan sold to a lot of people. But what I do think is that, capitalism has a fundamental and profound incentive program that pushes people to make money. So one of the things I appreciate is that you don't ignore capitalism in your writing. You don't really make up this utopian dreamland. You discuss, you actually wrote it here. We also understand how close the people back then came to failing. For every 2 steps forward, they take 1 step back. Every new technology caused new problems that needed to be solved. That's always the way change of that scale happens. I've always been an optimist and focused on the positive, so I'll steer clear of recalling the many disasters and stick to the mostly positive story that prevailed in the end. But I think one of the interesting things here is as you scale, as you change, as you innovate, you also create problems. But those problems actually create new industries, new niches, new jobs, new opportunities, new opportunities for investment. What do you think? I know you steered away from it, but what do you think are some of our greatest challenges over the next 30 years?
Well, there's 4, I would say. If you had to just take stock in this year, basically they all broke out. But I mean, they've happened before. But I'm saying, if you had to say, what are the things, if you're an American 2020, what are the things we have to get a handle on? I'd say there's four. One, and this year brought them all out in very dramatic fashion. One is we got to get a handle on climate change, and it's I mean, California here, we just had this horrendous year of wildfires.
Oh my God.
I mean, it's more to come, and it's just and also it wasn't just here; it was up and down the whole West Coast. It was in the I mean, anyhow, and you hurricanes and all that stuff. Anyhow, it's gotten beyond the point of like, oh, well, wouldn't it be cool if we did something about this? Or, it's a thing that has to get solved. And the series, in some respects, is literally trying to show, and the story, actually, if you really get into it, the fourth episode, essentially, a series of the fourth story, essentially tells how we actually, what I call, turn the corner on climate change. Because I think it's actually to the point now where we're going to have to, we can mitigate the worst parts of climate change, but we can't solve it like completely and go back to how it was in 1950 or something. Right. I think we're going to have to mitigate the worst of it, and I think we're going to adapt to it better or worse. But I call it turning the corner. We're going to essentially do a lot more than we are now, and we're going to essentially make it better and be able to do with it, thrive in it going forward. That's one challenge. Second challenge, I think, is we have to essentially rework, I would call it capitalism, not in a kind of the classic socialist Marxist thing, which is the right wing is kind of going batshit on. It's what's happened about capitalism. Even the people, I mean, Davos and all these people, the World Economic Forum, they're all talking the same problem, which is, there's two fundamental problems with capitalism right now. One is it doesn't account for the externalities that are created in an economy, like pollution and in particular climate, global warming pollution.
Right, like no carbon tax. There's no negative financial constraint when it comes to pollution.
In fact, you don't pay any price for it. So anyhow, point is that's unsustainable. That's why they call it sustainability. It's unsustainable system. It'll blow the planet to pieces, and we'll all be living in water world and all this stuff we're talking about. Second, you guys, particularly in Florida, you guys in Florida are like really going to be hurting at that.
We're actually we're right in the middle, so we might actually end up with like beachfront property.
We actually so that's exactly right. So we're in Orlando, so we're actually banking on that. So we know we're investing for the future.
All right, let's just set that aside about your personal situation. But there's but the unsustainable. So it's unsustainable for capitalism for one reason is externalities of pollution, particularly, and climate change. Second reason, though, is unsustainable for social reasons. It is not spreading the wealth broadly enough and deeply enough in our societies, and it is creating essentially a backlash of, you could say, historic proportions, which is what happens in these situations where there are getting increasing numbers of people that are not invested in sustaining the system, and it's not working for them, and it's working for people at the extremely top, and even just, you could say, the top 5%, or maybe you could even say the 10% of people on the planet might have some reason to kind of, hey, this is kind of working for me, although it's really, from a global point of view, probably closer to more 5 or even 2 or 3. But anyhow, the point being is, you can't have a system like that that's going to work over the next centuries, or a century, or even decades, that doesn't deal with that issue. And then even the capitalists are figuring this out, and it's just why you're watching populist nationalism all over the place. You're watching, the millennials talking about, socialism, and now and in ways that hadn't been talked to for generations. Anyhow, the point is, it's getting to be unsustainable. That has to get solvable. There's a lot of ideas out there how to do it, but anyhow, that's solvable. Third thing is we have to get past this political polarization. You can't have a situation where basically all the liberal democracies in the world, Western Europe, America, and even in places, other places, are just getting debilitated. They can't make long-term investments. They can't deal with climate change aggressively. The only country that's kind of doing it right now is authoritarian, dictatorships like, China and stuff, who can say, okay, we're going to move everybody from here to there. We're going to scale up, solar and we're going to basically make electric trains to connect. And, they can do it, but you don't want to live in that society. But anyhow, the point is we got to get past the polarization that is developing, not just America, but all through the West. That has to happen. And then the third, I would say the fourth thing, which kind of really, as a white guy, I would say I underappreciated and this year really brought it home to me more, is we got to deal with the racial inequities in this country that is essentially that has to come to terms with. I mean, we started with slavery. We had a civil war around the thing. We had Reconstruction to try to deal with it. That failed. We had a kind of civil rights thing to try to deal with it, and that's kind of not failed. And we got to do. And this is where the millennials and the Gen Z
Yes, that was what I was going to say. Yeah, your point you made.
They're finally saying we have to deal with this, people. And I think what happened this year in the midst of the pandemic and craziness and all the shit going on, wildfires and Trump, the election and all that, what did they get out there for? They got out there for racial kind of, let's get beyond this basically white supremacy, which is a good way to think about the system is skewed in such fundamental ways that it has to be dealt with. So I think I don't have as many answers to that one, except I do have a confidence that those two generations, millennials and Gen Z, are going to prioritize that in such a way, and they're 50-50 generations, meaning half of them are minorities. So it's not like either, they are the generation to figure this out, I would say. The other thing I would say, which is interesting, I say this in the pieces, I don't know if you caught this, Michael, but by 2100, the guy makes the comment, which I think is true. He says, basically by 2100, all Americans are people of color. Almost all Americans are people of color. And it's kind of a shock when you hear that at first, but then you think about it for a minute here. It's like if you have the millennials are 50-50 and basically Gen Z is 50-50, that in an environment like that has openness to diversity, they're intermarrying. And so the next generations are going to essentially be people of color. And so many of them, and there'll be some white couples, obviously, but increasingly, it's in everyone's interest. White people who's, my daughter, I'll literally tell you, my daughter is actually been for 5 years now with a guy who's African-American guy, and their two are going to have, mixed children. So
and they're going to have good-looking children.
And they're going to have good-looking children. I'm saying, it's like, this isn't an abstract issue for me. Right. I mean, I'm into that issue anyhow, and it's, something I support, but I was just telling you, there's a lot of the generations of my generation are going to say, well, this isn't those poor people, we got to help deal with that. It's like, my grandkids going to be discriminated, right? So I think it's going to shift, and then that generation will do another one. So it's really reasonable to think that in 2100, you would say, oh, well, all Americans are people of color. I mean, they all have some other races in them. Right. It's just there aren't any white people. It's just going to be not even happening. So it's an interesting way to think about it, actually.
Yeah. Have you ever seen Shameless by any chance? It's a show on Showtime. And so one of the interesting so you brought this up, but Kevin, he's married to a black woman, and so they're having kids, and he's talking about his kids, and he's like, oh, and the future people. And she's like, what are you talking about? What are future people? He's like, well, I just always imagine that, in 50, 100 years, all kids are going to be of mixed race. And so I just call them future people. And like, I've thought that for so long. Like it's taken us so long to get there, but I think we're really close. And I think this idea that, as we continue to see people, break down those cultural and racial barriers. I mean, it's just an obvious outcome. Like there's nothing that would, and the only thing that keeps that from happening is literally beliefs that are passed down from generation to generation that discourage it. I mean, I cannot tell you how surprising it is when Kristen and I will sit down with some friends for cocktails and we'll be chatting, and I can't tell you, like, you would be shocked how many people that we know now whose parents told them not to date a black females, whose parents told them not to date a black man. And this is 20 years ago. This is 15 years ago. This is 25 years ago that these females were getting told this messaging, and it's changing rapidly because of millennials and Gen Z. They're going, what are you talking about? I was raised with these people. I'm surrounded by these people. Like what? How?
Because our children would flip out.
Oh my
if
God.
They heard someone say that.
They would flip. Our kids would flip. They would like go off on this racist MFer if they heard something like that. But it's for real. Like we have to. I mean, it's not that long ago. It's not that long ago. It's crazy.
Well, it's even, I mean, there's like, I think in '68, there was still laws on the books in a lot of states of, banning interracial marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, I was a kid then, I mean, like I'm older than you guys, but I mean, in our lifetimes, we've watched that legally be the case. So
right.
I would get, but so I think there is kind of a way, again, this is the liberating side of thinking about the future from that longer perspective, which is the perspective of this whole series. Is it just makes you think about everything differently. You go, that's interesting. So if that's the case, then why am I so upset right now about these people in the streets? It's like, seems like, oh, well, that's probably, I can see why that'll be my kid in there, my grandkid or my grandkid's kid or whatever. It's good. Anyhow, the point is, it's a really a mind shift. And I think we're in it. And I think it's clear in more of the cosmopolitan. You guys are in Orlando and in Florida and California here and stuff. Particularly when you're around a lot more diversity, it's kind of obvious, and you kind of think, how's this working out? But I think this is what I mean by the dispersion. Actually, we never really fully got to that. But I would say the thing I said that California prefigured this thing about the country. But what's happening in real time is that these cities on the coast, particularly often in blue states, have gotten so expensive, and now with COVID allowing people to kind of go everywhere, I think what you're watching is the millennials and increasingly going to the heartland and cheap housing. I mean, it's happening all the time now. And also people of color, I think, immigrants and stuff. Yeah, they started in these, LA and all these, places, but they're starting to say, hey, man, it's cheaper in Iowa or something. And so, they end up working in a meat plant in Iowa, and then they settle there. And so it's happening all over the country. And so if you just look at this, it's a kind of a time bomb. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's essentially something that's just well, these people that are freaking out about it, it's like they're going to have to just come to terms with it. It's freaking them out, but it's happening in real time all around us. And I think the thing to kind of do is just relax. It's just, honestly, it's not that. It doesn't change the country that much. It's all good, it all works.
And soon enough, like you said, they become your neighbors. And when these immigrants are your neighbors, then you're in a closer circle of influence to have them understand where you're coming from. And once you understand your neighbor, then it's not quite so scary.
Right.
Completely. Right. Well, you saw that in Georgia. I mean, really what happened in Georgia in this last cycle is going to play out, in fact, in the election here to early January. It's like, you had these suburbs in the old days were kind of out of Atlanta were basically all these white, lily white, and there's no way you could even get a house out of there. But over time, it just got more and more diverse. People moved up, the immigrants came in, and pretty soon the whole metro area was like looking around and going, well, why don't we like you people? We're hanging out with you. We're going to drinks with you. We're mowing the lawn with you. It's like, and the president is like, oh yeah, that's good. And, who's voting red are these little rural places that, don't have that same, they just don't have that proximity or that familiarity. And I think that's changing fast. The country's urbanizing in a pretty radical, fast way.
Right. I want to share another little piece of, and this may, if you're listening right now and you're looking for a little hope, like this is cool. You write, if anyone back then had known that these generally positive developments were about to happen when the first pandemic hit, and notice you said the first pandemic hit in 2020, their anxiety would have dissipated. If anyone back then had known what everyone now knows, they would have had a huge strategic advantage and could have ended up making a lot of money too. So I'm a capitalist. I own my own business. I'm an investor, but I'm not a laissez-faire capitalist. I'm a very progressive capitalist, where I believe you need a strong governmental influence on markets in order to ensure that you're producing the best outcome for all of society. But that being said, what are you investing in, knowing what you know now?
Well, first let me talk about the big idea, and then I'll tell you that specific thing. Is like, here's one of the motivators of this whole series, this whole project, because it's really taken me about a year and a half to do this project. Not full time, because I'm doing other stuff too. But anyhow, it's been a really an interesting project here. By the way, I've interviewed 25 experts around the world, which is referenced in this series, and all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot of going on here, a lot of data I've been analyzing. But one of the reasons I was laying this out here is people right now are so fearful of the future. They are so filled with despair about what's ahead of us. They are completely overwhelmed with the sense that we can't solve these challenges. We can't, they're freaked out about everything going on. And so what I was trying to do with this thing was just to say, by kind of skewing the story a little bit, by just saying, let's draw out the positive possibilities of going forward here a little bit, and lay out, which are not pie in the sky, they're not Pollyannish, as you said, they're not waiting for space aliens or something to save everything. Right. I mean, there's plausible, possible things, and they're built on what I call the inexorables, a dozen trends that are essentially going to happen one way or the other. And so what I was just trying to do is lay that out and say, if you now get a glimpse of what could well happen in the future, like the people in the future looking back would know, right? It would essentially lower your anxiety. It would give you more hope for the future, because you'll see like, honestly, it looks like we have the clean energies that could actually scale up this time to actually turn the corner on climate change, as opposed to like, we're just doomed. It's all going to be screwed. And, we're all going to go down in a heap fireball of, kind of chaos in the end. I mean, you yet need to see this, and so, but people don't have the capacity to, just like out at the top of their head think, I understand how that could happen. They need to see that world. They need to see those trends play out. They need to kind of have someone walk them into that world and explain that world and show how it works. And that's what this series is about, and doing it. Now, if you do see those things, there are, it gives you a strategic advantage, honestly. And I do think in a very practical way as a business person, it gives you a way to make a shitload of money. Now, I'll say one reason. You asked me what I would invest in. I will say this to you about this. I won't go into this literal specifics.
We can talk about that later offline if you insist.
Exactly. But I'm telling you, and I lay this out very clearly in the piece, is like, we are going into a triple whammy, long boom of technology boom and economic boom, that this is, I would argue, is has a good chance of dwarfing the economic booms we saw in this last era from 1980 to 2020. There was a lot of a big boom economic. There was a tech boom off digital technologies and an economic boom, globalization all around the world. Anyhow, a bunch of ways to talk about that. There was a big boom off of World War II. We've talked about that. I think people are not wrapping their heads around what's ahead of us. And I'll tell you why. It's like, we talked about what's ahead of us when you pull on the second half of the planet, full bandwidth, AI. What is that going to do to innovation and all the different industries that are going to come off that? Second thing is, that's one world historical technology that's going to play out. Second world historical technology that's going to play out is biotech, and essentially two fundamental things. We have the genetic understanding of humans now, but also how genes work and how they play out and how to modify them and all kinds of stuff. Anyhow, there's a whole genetic understanding series of industries and services and products and all kinds of stuff going to come out. And then I would call, what you call a little broader, call it biological engineering, which includes a genetic engineering, which we now know how to edit the genome. Humans, as well as plants and animals and everything else, we're kind of limited on what we want to do with humans. But anyhow, the point is, we can now design nature in a way that used to be, it's like godlike powers. But anyhow, that's doable now. We're doing it. I mean, we're doing it consistently now. So anyhow, the point is, in the next 30 years, that thing is going to explode in things. And you're seeing the beginnings of it with this pandemic sparked, in the space of 9 months. We got all these vaccines that would have taken years to do. So anyhow, there's a whole thing going on about that. And then, so there's a whole biotech boom that's going to happen. And then the third one is the clean energy boom. And I will say, without question, we're going to, and you're watching it with the early Biden stuff here and all kinds of stuff, but we are finally going to take climate change seriously and scale up clean energies in a way that is going to be another world historical boom. And just put it this way, if you told an investor right now that the entire planet's energy system is going to go from a carbon-based one in 2020 to primarily a clean energy one in 2050, what part of that do you not see as an economic opportunity and a business opportunity for investment? The scale of that change is mind-boggling. Yeah. And I would just say, and then so you're going to have three of these things happening simultaneously on a globally interconnected planet. And so this is you talk so without going into, hey, this company might be good, although you can kind of go that way. Just that context is such that if people are worrying about, oh, the whole global economy is going to collapse and there'll be no growth and, you know, we can't do this, that's just nuts. And so anyhow, the other thing I would say about this, and the reason I'm saying this with such kind of confidence, you can say right now, is my original project that I did in the 90s, which I mentioned you, called The Long Boom. It was essentially trying to describe the long boom of technology boom off of digital technologies and essentially economic boom off of technology, digital technologies and globalization that was going to come off the 90s and was going to go to 2020. And we said a bunch of things like, yeah, Amazon was going to go from a goofball thing to, you know, $1 trillion company, those kind of things. But also the Dow. I'll just tell you, when my piece came out in 1997, explaining this future boom thing, the Dow was at 5,000, and it was at 5,000, and also another book came. I also wrote a book on this. The book went into multiple languages, and it was a very successful book. Another book at that time was called The Dow 30,000. It was at the time it was a kind of that book, and my book got kind of lumped together because it was about booms and all that, and people were making about the stock market boom. I was talking about more fundamental tech and economy boom, but basically it always got lumped in with the stock booms. And so people were sitting there, Dow 30,000, that's insane. There's
impossible.
No
never happened.
Never happened. What? They're just ludicrous. You people are nuts. And so I don't know. Have you looked at the Dow actually last few months? Or something?
Yes, it's literally like 30,100 something like that. It just peaked 30,000.
What do you know? It happened 25 years ago. You could actually say, hey, if this digital economy goes global and if we integrate this thing and if this happens for 25 years, the Dow will probably be the 30,000, you know, and, you know, you can't guarantee that, but that is a damn lot closer. In fact, in this case, totally prescient than what people at the time were saying, like, oh, no, it'll never happen, never happen, never happen. I mean, this is the thing. So I'm just saying, folks, we're in another one of those long booms. It's going to happen. Now, you know, devil's in the details. You got to find the right companies and all that kind of stuff. But I will say, it's we've got a lot of growth ahead of us. Yeah, and I'm like you. I'm not into. The only way to solve this is going to be a combination of strong government and vigorous business. It's not a one or the other thing. It's an alignment. And I make this very clear in this, particularly the piece of how we solve climate change. Is you have to have both to make this scale and move fast.
Yeah. What?
Oh, sorry. I thought you had something specific to say. Well, I was just going to say, you know, I completely agree with this idea that, like, you know, I it's so frustrating. Honestly, it's just so frustrating that people think that because you're a progressive or because you're a Democrat or because you vote, I wouldn't actually consider myself a Democrat. I would consider myself a progressive who tends to vote Democrat, who also is a capitalist. But
it's complicated.
It's complicated, but I think that it's so important to have like a guiding governmental direction to help get somewhere. Like the whole idea, you know, when I think about the importance of, you know, having regulations so that you don't have this laissez-faire economics. Like so many people don't recognize the extent to it. The hardcore Republicans, the Karens of the world who have, the protections that they have when they're driving their car to the store, or, whatever they're doing in their day, they're protected in so many ways that are invisible, and those invisible hands come from the government. No, there are very few, companies that are actually individually out there looking out for us as individuals. And if you can have a progressive government that's looking to rebuild the infrastructure of the United States, that's looking to get us off of fossil fuels, that's looking to leverage the power of technology, AI, decentralized digital infrastructures, and move us forward so that we can actually play the big game that I think we're being called to play, some fascinating, beautiful, amazing, extraordinary things are going to happen. And back to your point, just about those industries and being an investor and knowing where to go. Like, I think it's so important to look at the three things that you talked about, and then go look for companies that are, maybe they're not the biggest companies, maybe they're smaller companies that are actually providing the resources to those bigger companies. And that's what I've found, most of my investing success has been in, some bigger companies, but some smaller companies that are actually providing the resources to those bigger companies to produce, what ultimately will be the future. And I think it's incredibly important.
Well, one thing I'll mention, building on that, I totally agree with you. I will say, again, I think this progressive label is going through changes. But I always make a clear distinction. So, for example, I will say what California Democrats are definitely pro-capitalist. Now, there is a faction of what is considered sometimes the progressive wing of the California Democrats that sound often kind of anti-capitalist or anti-market, or, government has to kind of run everything kind of thing. That's a minority. It's like, think of it, it's like Gavin Newsom's a great example, who I actually have interviewed in events and know to some extent myself.
And he's getting pounded on right now. Like, if you bring up Newsom, like you could start a bar fight.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But I will tell you this. But again, from a historical point of view, take a look at him. I will say, he totally gets, and this is a general California thing. Californians, I mean, they're entrepreneurs. They want to run stuff. I mean, they don't want the government running everything. That's just like some old idea that's just super outdated. It's like, I mean, Newsom himself was a successful businessman. He made a bunch of money. Anyhow, it's like there is a misnomer out there that the democratic, and I would call progressive way forward. Think of the progressives. Think of it as conservative and progressive as the distinction in American history. Now, conservative can be right-wing, kind of populist nationalists. It can also be kind of traditional conservative. I mean, there's a range of conservatives, but in general, you can say, oh, that's a conservative way forward. There's the same thing in progressive. You can go from crazy, people like communists and, kind of hardcore socialists. You can also go to kind of Obama, and Biden kind of,
neoliberal capitalism.
You can go with that. You can go into kind of, I would call Gavin Newsom and I would say Kamala Harris too is kind of this Californian kind of entrepreneurial kind of Democrat thing.
I just think of like California dream, and there's like they're just like surfing on this wave of capitalism, but like throwing out like rice packets to everybody that they pass by.
Well, exactly. So anyhow, the point is, there's a range of these things, and I would just say we got to get over the kind of the general way to think about it is there's these two basic approaches. There's a range of sub debates inside there, and then by the way, the same thing happened with FDR. It wasn't like FDR was, you think of him as more progressive, or they called it at that time more liberal. That was just the moniker they used at that time. But I mean, he was constantly fighting with his, at the time there were literally socialists and communists who were in the coalition behind the kind of New Deal coalition. But he had some of them in his cabinet once in a while and stuff like that. But it wasn't like, and he was being called from the outside by the other side, the Republican conservatives. They're calling him a socialist, but the actual socialists in its coalition were always calling him out that he was being too much of a capitalist. This happens at every juncture. It's like the country is a huge country. We need, when you essentially take a country of 300 and, what are we now? 350 million people. and you got two parties, there's going to be a range of stuff in there, and they're not going to friggin' agree lockstep on everything. So of course, so instead of focusing on the little debate on the fringes of like what policy you're going to do, think of it as the big picture. There's a country that's going to go one way or they're going to go that way. And I think we're in this place where it is shifting from a primarily conservative thing, which, by the way, defined how Bill Clinton was kind of working within a kind of conservative era. And Obama, I would also say, was kind of working within a conservative era. It's like he couldn't do everything they wanted to maybe do, but they were like, reforming welfare was what Clinton was doing, because around him was this whole conservative thing about getting rid of welfare. Anyhow, that kind of thing was the conservative era. I think now we're in a different framework, which is I'm terming more progressive era, and it'll disappoint some of the far left kind of crew that'll say we're not going far enough, fast enough, but it also will piss off the other conservative crew that's saying we're way too radical for the country. But I would say in general, looking back on what's going to happen in this country in the next 30 years, particularly from the view of American history in the future, they're going to say, okay, right around 2020, they shifted direction. They started moving in this more progressive direction. They took on these big challenges, and the world, America changed in those coming decades. And in fact, so did the world. And that is the series that I'd encourage everybody on here to watch a medium called The Transformation. And there's like literally 6 stories. 5 are out right now. They're all good reads.
Why don't you share exactly how people can find you? And I'm not wrapping up the conversation just yet. I've got 1 or 2 more questions, but while we're at it, just go ahead and share with you like how people can find you on social media, where they can find this new piece that you came out called The Transformation. Like, just tell people where they can find all of that.
Well, my name's Peter. I'm peterleyden.com. You can go there, and that's kind of my base in the world there. Explains everything I do and my background, all stuff. So peterleyden.com, and my last name is Leyden. So peterleyden.com there. On Twitter, I'm Pete Leyden, not Peter, because I go by Pete and kind of short term. Pete Leyden on Twitter. You can follow me there. I'm often pointed there. And Medium, you can just go to same Pete Leyden. .medium.com. Boom, you can get to where all the stories are there. And ultimately, the series, The Transformation, has its own world in Medium, and that goes to medium.reinvent, like the word reinvent.net. If you go to that, that's The Transformation. Or once you're in Medium, just search for The Transformation. All these stories are open and free. They're not behind any kind of paywall. Anyone can read them. They're a good read. You can read them through the apps. You can read them through the web. I would encourage you to do that and spread the word. And also, if you get me, you can get me through my website, and there's ways to contact me that way. And I'm happy to keep the conversation going well beyond this. And although this has been a fantastic conversation, I know we're not done yet, but I'm just saying it's been a really good conversation, and I totally appreciate how you two have. We're in sync here with our kind of the energy and the excitement about the future, honestly, because we're in it.
Yeah, well, honestly, we fucking need it. I mean, it's
That's another way to think of it.
Yeah, 2020 was a shitbag for most people, and like I'm kind of like you. Like, I'm always an optimist. I'm always looking for the thing. Like in March, like I was it was very hard time. Like I remember. My father was just retiring, and like he was about to step away from his job, and then the stock market tanked, and I was like, okay, like what's the optimistic viewpoint here? And then like I started telling my mom I'm gonna do these investments. She's like, well, I'll send you money and you can invest for me. And like we just started doing all these investments in March, and like we just saw this huge like awesome return. And it's like I'm always looking for the opportunities in a bad time, but at the same time. People are really struggling right now, and it's a very hard time for so many people. And I just wanted to when I saw your piece on the next 100 years, like for me, it was an opportunity to step back and look at the big picture and maybe bring people some hope who don't have as much right now. And I think, it's really tough. And I think we need more people stepping up, not only to give hope, but also to give like real help in the real world. But before we wrap up, you talk about 5 core innovations in Transformed. You actually write, the Enlightenment came up with 5 core innovations that created the operating system upon which Western societies and ultimately societies around the world built on for more than 200 years. The transformation superseded all 5 of those core innovations and created a different civilization in the process. Their steam engine was our digital computer, the core building block of the new system. They scaled up carbon energies, and we did the same thing with clean energies. They had their industrial revolution. We had our biological revolution. They invented financial capitalism. We reinvented sustainable capitalism, which I really appreciate you bringing that point up. They invented representative democracy, and we devised digital democracy. Of all those things, the one that jumped out at me that I'm the most curious about is digital democracy. Like, what do you specifically mean by digital democracy?
Whoa. Well, first of all, I appreciate you calling that part of the series out because, and by the way, the next story, I do talk about it in the story you're referencing there, but I also do devote a whole story to it next week. It's going to be coming out on this civilizational piece. And so let me just say something about that, and then I'll talk about the digital democracy briefly here. This is the biggest idea of the whole piece, honestly, and I think the most unusual, but it's also the trippiest. So only kind of a guy, so it kind of puts people off, and they try to like, whoa, what is this guy talking about? And but so let me just give
I
it
wasn't that way.
Okay, well you're into it. That's good. But when you talk about changing the civilization, like some people have a hard time wrapping their heads around this. But so let me put it in context here for a second, which is the changes that we're going to see in the next 30 years. And I would think also coming on these changes that we've even seen in the last 40, from about 1980, when the digital computers came in, the personal computer and the early internet and that kind of stuff. And anyhow, the changes we've been watching, and we've kind of been talking about the rise of these tech companies and the globalization economy and the rise of China and, all this stuff. And anyhow, there's been that period, which we kind of get now. It's like, okay, got us into this mess of climate change and other stuff. And then, but I think the next 30, which I lay out here to kind of the beginnings of what I call the transformation, will continue through the century. And I think if you look at it in 2100, when they look back on 120 years from 1980, think of it as, but particularly around the acceleration that happens right around now, 2020, they will see those changes as so profound that they'll say we're really operating in a different civilization
right
at the end of the century than we actually were in coming out of it or going into it, let's say in 2000. Right. And so let me say one more thing about that. It's like the last time the world saw essentially the invention of a civilization was essentially the Enlightenment in Western Europe and the United States at the very early days. It was you can dispute the timing of it, but it was roughly about 1650, 1680, kind of in the 17th century, through the 1700s or through the 18th century to about 1800. So there's about 120 years there that saw the invention of all these fundamentally new innovations that were world historical. You mentioned them and quickly, but the steam engine. We didn't have an engine. Humans would have to lift everything in animals, and then all of a sudden we thought, we can actually have these machines that do it. And then we can actually go from just throwing logs on a fire to like coal and then oil and then anyhow carbon energies to like supercharge our energy systems, and then industrial production to kind of scale up all this stuff. And financial capitalism is a huge one that you forget about, but essentially before that period, there was no gold standard. Like people would take a coin and they'd chew it and give it to you, and you didn't know if it was right or if it was even gold. And anyhow, you had no way to trade, and no one trusted anyone. Anyhow, so we created essentially financial capitalism to really made capitalism work. And then representative democracy, as we know, all human history had been run by just kings, and, that's it. And then finally, out of feudalism, we figured out how to have representative democracy. All those were world changing, but they also were fundamentally different civilization. It's like it ran differently than anything came before. And the rules of that old feudalism and that old king thing and that old kind of, craft, handmade everything didn't apply to the new ones. They had to invent everything kind of differently. They had to build a civilization. That civilization we're still in right now.
Yeah.
In other words, we're doing everything is the same, and it's gotten us into trouble, with climate change coming out the carbon and all this stuff. But it's also made an amazing world. It's scaled up incredible production and lifestyles, and here we are talking to each other across the country. And anyhow, amazing shit.
Yeah.
But we still are working in the same 5 things. We haven't changed it. What I'm positing in this thing, in the next 30 years, we will make huge progress in those other 5 things that are essentially going to supersede those other innovations. And in doing so, through the rest of the century, from 2050, because the stories only go to 2050, we'll have another 50 years of innovations off that. And that at the end of that period, we will be in a world that will be all digital, like everything will be computerized and everything will be interconnected, and it'll have, AI clerksing through it and all that kind of stuff. But anyhow, all digital, it'll be fully global. It'll essentially be operating on a planetary scale they'll still be, hey, you'll still live in your city and you'll organize your little local neighborhoods. But you essentially, from a systems point of view, it'll all be global, or we won't be there because of climate change. So anyhow, it'll be all global, working on a planetary scale. That's totally different than every system we've had before, which at the most were national or international between nations. Will be global. And the third thing will be sustainable, meaning it'll be sustainable in terms of the planet. So we won't blow the climate out. We won't kind of overpollute the thing. We won't run over all natural living things. Anyhow, it'll be sustainable, and it'll be sustainable socially because you won't have riots and revolutions and coming up all the time. And now, will that happen? It's not guaranteed. And in fact, many things could go wrong. And there's all these dystopian science fiction things of how we'll all be, running around like, savages at that time because everything will be destroyed. So I get that it's not guaranteed. But if we make this successfully, which we can do, we will be in a different world, that's a different civilization. Because I will tell you, a society where you're essentially monitoring every corner of the planet for the climate, adjusting our responses to, what to do to kind of adjust that climate, and, regionally, dealing with this kind of integrated global ecosystem instantaneously. That thing is a lot different than a system where you're just praying for rain every day and hoping God is going to basically rain. And if it doesn't rain, we're screwed. I mean, it's just so different. It's like, so all these things we're used to and that are still kind of defining the way we run stuff. I mean,
it's only a generation away. I used to stand with my grandpa looking at the rain gauge when he was worried about the crops, so.
Well, and to this day right now, there's a lot of people like that. My mom's like that too. Anyhow, I'm just saying though, if we get to that point, it's a different thing. And to do that, you're going to need a different civilization. And so that civilization will be called something different. And so the real name of the transformation of the series, you can just think of it, it's transforming our society, transforming our technologies. The idea by the end of the series, you realize, is that we call this entire 120-year period from 1980 to 2100 as the transformation, in the same way we talk about that whole period from 1680 to 1800 through the 1700s, the Enlightenment. Right now you say the Enlightenment and you think, okay, that's Isaac Newton and that's the founding fathers. In the end, essentially were, in America here, were the end of the Enlightenment. They were essentially innovating the world's, essentially the biggest innovation in representative democracy was America and the founding fathers. And but that was part of a 120-year thing, and it was highly influenced and pretty much driven by Europe more than the U.S. The U.S. was kind of an outlier. But anyhow, that thing, we're in another one of those. We'll call it, in the long view of history, we'll call it something. I mean, who knows? They'll call it the transformation. But in my way of telling the story, they'll call it a 2-word thing like that. And we'll, just like you say, Roman Empire, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the transformation. There'll be something we'll call like that that'll say, that's when the world went digital, global, sustainable, and boom, it was a different era from that point on. And that's the fun part about the piece. And so anyhow, that's the longer way to think about it, which is the trippy way to think about it. And by the way, my talk, which I'm going to do here, which will be streamed in February 9th, is about that civilizational thing is really the way I'll be going deep on that. But anyhow, the long and short of it, the last piece is the digital democracy. So I'm going to punt on this briefly because I will tell you, out of those 5 innovations, I'm very clear how the digital computers supersede machines. In fact, that was the story of the last 40 years, and I was been all over that. The second one about carbon energy transition to clean, I lay it out in my series, and it's clear how we can do that. The third one about financial or industrial production to industrial revolution to biological revolution. I also laid it out about how we're going to do that when I'm talking to you about biological engineering, all that stuff. That's laid out. That's understood how that's going to happen. And the fourth one about sustainable capitalism, I gave you some of those ideas of how we could actually evolve from shareholder to stakeholder and a bunch of stuff that goes beyond that to kind of make that. The one I don't know, and I'm honestly say this, is the digital democracy one in terms of how that would work. But I will say this, and in terms of the story, the way I play this out is that the political innovation in the Enlightenment came at the very end of that period of innovation. Because it's the last thing to go. The technologies changed, the energy sources changed, the economy changed. And then it was only at the end of that period that it wasn't just America, it was also the French Revolution. Essentially, democracy, the governing systems changed. I think it's going to be the same here, which is we're going to see the technologies are changing. I already laid out three booms, three huge world historical booms. We're going to see the economics around that. We're going to see all that change. And I think it's not clear yet, but eventually we will come to the political innovation, the governmental innovation. And I'll say one last thing about that. And so I kind of say it's going to happen in the second part of this, which I don't really focus on in this series, although it might speculate in future series. But here's what I will say to you about this, which I think is, I have thought a lot about this, is many of the problems you're watching in today's politics are being talked about as essentially the limits of that Enlightenment system we devised 225 or 250 years ago.
Right.
The Electoral College, this compromise between the slave owners and the rural states. It was a total goofball thing about the electors. The kind of Senate was the same thing. We had to get buy-in, and we tried to do, okay, everyone gets 2 seats. And so now you got California with 40 million people, the same 2 senators as Wyoming with, essentially less than 1 million. It's like, Wyoming, Wyoming could fit in like one neighborhood of LA, right? And they got, anyhow, that thing is just, it's a system they did. When Thomas Jefferson and all those guys devised the thing, they didn't even understand electricity. They didn't even know it happened. I mean, Ben Franklin was out there with a kite trying to figure out, wow, there's something enlightening that might be interesting. It's like, so they had no idea about electronics or computers or instantaneous kind of communication. So what we are feeling right now is essentially the obvious thing that's going to happen, that the world has moved so much farther than that totally out of dated, completely brittle, goofball kind of compromise system, which was a beautiful thing in its time. Super innovation over, the divine power of kings, it was totally better than that. But it is so over its head on what a complex, 350 million people instantaneously connected throughout the world and all this stuff we know, flying around in planes all the time. That thing just can't. It's dysfunctional. It's getting
so different.
And so what I do think is going to happen is that we're going to, Daisy, if you reinvent governing and democracy for the 21st century, you would be insane not to take advantage of computer technologies.
Right.
Just like the founding fathers, if they looked around at the time, they said, okay, we got to build a government. Like, how are we going to do it? Well, we're going to have to get everyone to come and talk. So you got to take a horse from this, it's going to get, so we'll gather once a year and whatever.
You didn't mean to say it, but you said the confounding fathers.
Anyhow, if they had computers, they would have been, of course they would have used computers. Like, who wouldn't use computers? So what's going to happen is some kind of evolution is going to happen this century. I don't know enough about the space to really speculate. I know some people are working on that. But I will say this, is I would be extremely surprised if we don't get a fundamental reinvention of governing systems, possibly through a convention, a constitutional convention. There might be something comparable that comes off the old system that legitimizes it somehow. But I cannot imagine that we will be running America in the end of this century the way we are now, because frankly, it ain't working.
Well, yeah, and I think to your point, I mean, like the fact that you brought up this digital democracy, and I really appreciate your honesty and your forthcomingness to be like, well, I know it has to happen. I haven't done all the research yet, so I just like to lay out the gauntlet to like the random Twitch user or the YouTuber who like stumbles upon this podcast. Like, I want to find like that person who's just like so passionate, who just wants to dive deep into it, because I think there is something here. I mean, obviously, you look at, you know, there's nothing that you can hand a person who is distraught over Trump losing the election and say, here, look at this. This proves there's no fraud. Like, there's nothing physically, there's nothing, there's no way to prove anything to them. So we're going to need at some point some sort of, you know, crypto way of, no, I'm serious. Like cryptocurrency, cryptocurrency is built on blockchain. Blockchain is this idea that we can like lock in and create unhackable.
I was just reading how they're like finding the crap out of those Robinhood guys today. So
oh, really? That's
all right,
interesting. I'm actually quite curious about that. I want to know what actually happened there. But seriously, like this, you know, we've got to figure this out, and I think it's going to be. I think we're going to have to figure it out, and I think this election proved that, and I think it's going to push us forward into being able to do that. Nothing happens overnight. The cliche is Rome was not built in a day. Everybody out there, be patient. Realize that these forces that Pete is talking about are literally unstoppable unless we like blow ourselves up or we get wiped out by climate change before we can make these happen.
Or if we get too scared. I mean, because like when you're listening to it, it sounds very overwhelming. It sounds a bit scary, but like it's okay. You can go with the
agreed.
Go with the flow. Take it one step at a time.
I would totally. Yeah, the fear. I think the biggest problem right now is fear of the future. It's debilitating to people, and it's also allowing you know, people on both sides, but to just undermine any kind of progress. And to be fair, though, I will say this about American history. You know, just I know we're probably getting to the end here somehow, but I don't know. We can keep talking all night here. But I will say this one thing about American history, which is America has essentially gone through about four. I think this is going to be the fifth reinvention of America since that founding father stage. And we've gone through these periods where the technologies change, the economy changes, power shifts, all kinds of stuff happens. And essentially we get to these points that we have to essentially do some fundamental reinvention and changes to kind of move ahead. And we watched it around the Civil War. We got trapped in, you know, we had to resolve this slave owner to kind of free labor economies and anyhow, get beyond that thing. And honestly, that was brutal and difficult, but eventually we got through that. And then we had to go with the kind of robber barons and the oil and you know, great railroad barons and stuff. We had to have a kind of a reinvention around the early 1900, kind of early 20th century, and the kind of the progressive era. And then we had to go through this thing in the 30s and the crash and the, you know, rise of fascism. And that thing came out of that was the war and the post-war boom. And when we had this Reagan revolution and we had a kind of re-generalize, you know, kind of more conservative era that kind of made it more entrepreneurial and made shit happen. And now we're in another one. And I just say what happens around every one of these kind of junctures, it gets the passion gets super high. Both sides get extremely invested in the outcome. Politics gets really polarized and gets paralyzed. We can't do shit. And we really talk like almost close to Civil War. We did go to Civil War various times, but if you look at the rhetoric of the 30s, it was, you know, it was extreme and passion super, super high. And anyhow, the point is, we do get through these periods. We do broker a new kind of coalition, an ascendant coalition. We do create a new majority. We do reinvent the systems. We do kind of move forward. And I am absolutely convinced we're going to do it. We're doing it again. We're in the process of it. We're going to do it again. We're totally capable of doing it. But in those periods, it's confusing and really difficult. And it's hard for people to see it. And so this series is my attempt to kind of lay out how you can imagine it will go, not in some fantasy way, but in a very plausible way, well argued on the basis of trends in motion, things that are playing out. And I think it's helpful in these junctures. But I will say this: whether it's my scenario that of positive scenario of the future, plausible one, or some other one, I'm convinced we will get through this juncture and we'll get beyond this kind of paralysis politically and polarization, and we will actually move ahead in ways that I think are going to be much more positive. Most people are going to find it's going to be a more positive future than they're worried about, and but it's not inevitable, and we all have to kind of do our part to move ahead. So I hope people take it, and I hope you guys read the piece, but also listen to this and spread the word. And we can do this, and we need to do this, and like there's no time to waste. So let's get moving now.
Yeah, we have no fucking choice but to do this. Pete, I don't throw this word around lightly, and Kristen can't stand when I use this word, but your wisdom is fucking like I'm so appreciative of that you've really you've stepped back, you've taken the knowledge of the things that you've gained, you put them together in a way that you can communicate it, and it's just extraordinary. Your passion, your purpose, it's just truly immeasurable. It's the kind of hope that we really need in this kind of polarized moment. So I really appreciate you sharing everything you've shared with us today. And I hope we can do this again sometime.
Down for it. And let's stay in touch. I often you get kind of people interviewing you for a podcast or an interviewer and who don't kind of get it, and they don't really respond, or they kind of have a very kind of combative kind of way to go at it. And this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I've had my one beer, but now I got to run to the fridge and get another beer. It's now dark, as you can see here. And now I'm finally doing my Friday evening. As opposed, you guys are kind of deep in your night, whatever, but I'm like started. So I appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing what you do with this thing. And I hope people who do, kind of run with these ideas. And thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
It was a pleasure.
All right.
Thanks, Pete. Awesome. All right. Bye-bye.